I never thought the ordinary parts of life could be the things that change me the most. I'm not dramatic by nature. I prefer lists and calendars. I work in software and live in a mid-sized city that is quiet enough to feel anonymous and cramped enough that people's lives overlap more than they should. My name is Mark, I'm 34, and for the past 6 years the person I lived with was Anna. We weren't married, but we had a kind of domestic rhythm that felt permanent. Shared groceries, a faded couch, a plant I kept forgetting to water, framed photos from trips that no longer felt recent because they were woven into routine. Anna worked in events, a job that meant unpredictable hours and last-minute travel. At first it was easy to accept. I respected her ability to juggle 100 tiny logistics, and I learned to be okay with empty plates half the week. She used to drive everywhere. She liked control in small things. She liked to pick the music, the route, the radio station. To me it was a detail, one of those things that thread into the fabric of a relationship and become invisible. About 1.5 years ago she began using a rideshare app more and more. At first I thought it was convenience. Traffic, tiredness, the cost of parking. She said it helped her focus between meetings and compressed errands. She began to request the same driver, which struck me as a small oddity but not a worry. It was easy to accept. She mentioned his name once or twice in passing, Marco, the way someone refers to the barista who remembers their order. I trusted her. I trusted the person I'd settled down with, the woman whose things were scattered across the apartment the same way mine were. I trusted the stability of small patterns. Her mugs, her order at the deli, the way she left the bedroom light on when she came home late. Those small patterns accumulate and become the architecture of a life together. You don't notice when a brick gets loose. You notice only when a wall falls. The change wasn't immediate. It was a slow rearrangement of mornings and evenings. She began to choose the driver more explicitly. She'd say, casually, that Marco was easy to talk to, that he knew an off-menu coffee shop, that he had a calming manner. She started scheduling rides in advance. She began to prefer rides at odd hours. She developed reasons that made sense. A last-minute site visit, a client dinner that ran late, an industry panel across town. What felt different was how often she requested the same name. Sometimes it was every day. Sometimes multiple times a day. She would come home later than she said, but she always had an explanation. Traffic, an extra meeting, field staff needing help. I learned to check the app on occasion. Not because I suspected anything, but because it was reassuring. A digital breadcrumb trail that mapped where she was supposed to be. It never occurred to me that the trail might lead somewhere else entirely. When I voiced, gently, that it seemed odd to always have the same driver, she laughed it off. She said he was just a good listener, that he made the time go by. I accepted that answer the way you accept small mysteries in people you love. It's easier, sometimes, to let questions slide because the cost of asking them feels higher than the potential answer. The night everything changed was ordinary in every way that matters. It was a Thursday, a midweek blur of deadlines and dinner that I ate out of habit. A frozen meal. A glass of something I forgot the name of. The news murmuring from a corner of the living room. Anna said she had a client dinner across town. She kissed my forehead, grabbed her jacket, and asked me not to wait up. She asked me to lock the door when I do bed down, and I promised. She requested the ride. The app pinged with the driver's name, Marco. The ETA, the car make and model, the license plate. The kind of data that feels neutral and competent. Night slipped the city under its wing and I fell asleep watching the glow of the streetlight through our blinds. At 2 a.m., my sleep fractured. A notification I didn't expect. A message in the app. Trip complete. I checked the time. 1:56 a.m. Not unusual, given her schedule. I felt relieved in an old, automatic way. She was home. She wasn't answering her phone, but I assumed it was on silent. I lay there and imagined her inside, shoes by the door, wine breath and laughter. I woke up later to the sound of the apartment being unlocked. She came in quietly, slipped into bed, murmured a tired love, and the apartment settled again. In the morning she was professional and composed. She said it was a long pitch and she only remembered falling asleep on the couch for a moment. That was the last time ordinary felt solid. A few weeks later, little pockets of inconsistency began to gather. The rides with Marco were more frequent. Her explanations were still plausible. An event overrunning, a catering problem, a late-night venue breakdown. But there were moments I found odd. Lipstick on a collar that could be explained by a careless coat, a receipt in her purse for a sushi place she claimed she hadn't been to, a faint scent in her hair that I couldn't place. Each single thing was negligible. Together they started to feel like evidence. I checked the app with more frequency. Not because I was a detective, but because curiosity breeds attention. The trip history showed patterns I could no longer ignore. Rides at all hours, overlapping with times she had claimed to be elsewhere. Short rides that began and ended at addresses I had never seen her mention. Names of places I'd never heard. Sometimes the driver's messages, innocuous thanks for a pleasant ride, showed up in the history. Small communications that felt like stray leaves blown against a window. I kept asking myself whether this was suspicion or instinct. Both. I told myself it was fear and tried to tamp it down. I tried to trust the version of our life I wanted to believe in because living otherwise was exhausting. There is a certain point where not knowing becomes unbearable. It's like being in a room with a fire on the other side of the wall. You can ignore the heat for a while, but eventually the smoke finds its way through. One night, after a row of excuses and an ache that settled behind my breastbone, I made a decision I still hate myself for. I followed. I didn't plan it theatrically. I waited until she ordered a ride that had an unusual pickup location, a hotel she said she'd be checking for a supplier who I later found out was out of town. I took a taxi in my own car, kept a distance I felt foolish about, watched the app ping with her driver's movement. I followed the route the app gave me like a map of a life I was about to trespass into. When the car stopped at a dim residential street that I didn't recognize, my stomach closed. I sat in my car and watched Anna and the driver sit in the vehicle for a long time. The street lamp cast a halo. Their silhouettes were small and private in a way our home had been until then. I waited until the car drove away, and I followed it, slow, careful, a kind of secretive, desperate choreography that felt grotesque when I admitted it to myself. The car pulled into a parking lot behind an old cinema. A figure went inside. The driver circled, parked, and sat in the car. I watched through the windshield as he took out his phone, thumbed at it, and then looked toward the cinema entrance. It was humiliating to feel my heart thunder so loudly I was sure it sounded like a drum to them all. I stepped out of my car for the first time since leaving the apartment. My hands were steady in a way I found shameful. I approached the cinema door and peered inside. Anna was there, sitting across a small table with a man who was not a supplier, not a colleague. She looked animated, alive in a way she had not been at home. The man's profile matched the driver's silhouette. Marco sat across from her, and the thing I feared crystallized into shape. I did not approach. I did not shout. I walked away and let the world tilt in the way it does when gravity rearranges your center. When I returned to the car that night, I made a choice to wait until she came home. I wanted to feel the confrontation be mine, controlled, tidy, a thing that would resolve with an explanation. She came home at dawn, tired in a way that hung from her like a cloak. I asked her a single question. Where had she been? She gave me words that fit the world she had been building. That night she'd said she needed air, had run into an acquaintance, had caught up over coffee. It was the same cadence of excuses I'd grown used to. My voice didn't rise. I did not ask about Marco. I sat there with the knowledge I had and let it press into me. Days passed and I was both present and elsewhere. I performed my life. Work, grocery runs, paying bills, smiling in the right moments. At night I would press my face into the pillow and taste the same metallic taste that anxiety leaves. I could have confronted her. I could have laid out the facts and demanded an answer. Instead, I cataloged everything, receipts, times, patterns, like evidence for a future case against probability. It felt safer to be a collector of facts than to be a human demanding the truth. Eventually, I could no longer bear the weight of the secret. I knew the temptation to say nothing and preserve some version of the life we had, but that felt like a slow death. I begged myself for clarity. The night I found the messages in her phone was not heroic. I sat in the kitchen, the refrigerator light a small, austere glow, and read words that had been written in a casual intimacy I had only imagined in prophecy. The messages were not explicit in the way movies would have them be. They were banal in tone, full of jokes and places to eat and questions about how the week was going. They were, horrifically, the same kind of messages I used to send when I wanted to be close. The difference was there were more of them, and they were written at times when she had told me she was somewhere else. I did not scream. I did not cry immediately. I folded into silence and let each line land like rain on a metal roof. The next morning I sat across from her with the phone in my hand like a relic. She met my eyes with a look I had never truly seen there before. A face that was suddenly younger, or older, split by the knowledge between us. She said she was sorry. She said she had been lonely. She said she didn't know how it happened. She said she thought she could keep it separate, that it felt ephemeral and unmoored from our life, that she had convinced herself of things in the fog of late nights and flattering attention. What I heard was not just words. I heard the collapse of an architecture I had trusted. I heard the thinness of promises that had been propped by habit and not by relentless, chosen care. The aftermath was not cinematic. It was made of small cruelties and awkward practicalities. There were conversations about leaving, about staying, about couples counseling and whether something called love could survive on patchwork. Anna insisted she loved me. She insisted she never wanted to hurt me. She said the affair was not about me. She said it was about a gap she hadn't realized existed. My friends told me to leave. Their advice was black and white and easy to hold. They brought over bottles of whiskey and maps of how my life would look without her. Some of them were right to say that staying would be a slow erosion. Some of them didn't see the way my own memory of us had been stitched with genuine tenderness, the late-night projects, the quiet acts of care, the shared jokes no one else would understand. We tried being honest in ways that felt like surgery. We sat in the living room and listed things that were true, things that needed repair, things that could not be made whole again. Anna wanted counseling. She wanted to attend hours with me and then alone. She wanted to show me she could change. I wanted to be loved back in a way that made sense. There were nights when it felt possible, and others when I saw the cracks and believed them irreparable. The practicalities were petty in comparison to the emotional violence. There were questions about where to keep the toothbrush, how to divide keys, who would keep the apartment if we split. There were days when we existed under the same roof like two damaged ships tied to the same dock, trying not to scrape each other's hull. Months passed and the immediate heat of betrayal cooled into an ambiguous ache. Counseling sessions revealed truths we had not spoken about. My own complacency, her appetite for attention, the ways we'd allowed schedules and fatigue to hollow the rituals that once tethered us. It turned out the affair was a symptom of neglect on both sides. She had been drawn to the ease of being admired. I had been drawn to the idea that devotion was silent and constant. Diagnosis didn't equal absolution, but it gave us something like a language to address the rot. We tried new things slowly. We set rules we both hated, no secrets about our phones, a calendar we checked together, evenings locked off for each other without screens. We rebuilt rituals as deliberately as one might rebuild a house after a fire, hammer by hammer. Some nights were small triumphs. A movie laughed at together, a meal cooked in tandem without one person taking over, a drive with the radio turned down and the conversation allowed to breathe. Other nights were collapses into old indifference, and then we had to rebuild again. I will not pretend it was noble. Many times I resented her, and many times I resented myself for the resentment. There were moments when her apologies felt like a bandage and moments when they felt like the honest work of someone trying to be different. There were moments when it felt like forgiveness was a gift and others when it felt like a cost I could not afford to pay. If there is a single thing this experience taught me, it is that love is not a static thing you inherit. It is practice. It is the repeated decision to show up even when the novelty has faded, the deliberate small acts that say, over and over, I see you and I choose you. Infidelity, for me, was not a sudden monster that arrived out of nowhere. It was the consequence of many tiny disinvestments that added up until the glue softened. I learned that trust can be rebuilt, but that rebuilding is a different life from the one that existed before. I learned that forgiveness is not a single moment but a series of actions. Consistent boundaries, openness, the anniversaries of changed behavior. I learned to interrogate my own passivity, the ways I had allowed logistics and schedules to replace curiosity and tenderness. I also learned to be honest with what I cannot tolerate. There were days when angry righteousness would have been easier than the slow labor of repair. There were days when leaving would have been the cleaner line. But I found value in the ambiguity between leaving and staying. That ambiguity forced a kind of mental rigor. If we were to continue, what would that mean? What would we be required to give up? What would we build instead? In the end, whether we stayed together or separated felt less like a verdict and more like an ongoing experiment in moral courage. I chose to try. She chose to try. That choice was both fragile and fierce. It has been over a year since I followed that ride. We live in the same apartment, though the couch has been traded for a smaller one and the plant is dead because life has been busy with other kinds of work. We go to counseling sometimes, and sometimes we fail to go at all. We celebrate small victories and argue about old tendencies. I still think about Marco occasionally, though less like a wound and more like a weathered scar that tells me where the bone was once broken. Forgiveness did not make me exempt from pain. It made me responsible for it. I still carry memory like luggage that I cannot set down, but I have also started to carry other things. A capacity for more pointed questions, a willingness to express needs before they calcify into grievances, and a new kind of humility. About how love needs tending. I cannot promise that this story ends with a neat closure. It does not. Human lives rarely conform to the catharses we expect. What I can say is this. The person who cheated was someone both ordinary and complicated. The person who loved her was not a hero or a victim, merely a person trying to reconcile ideals with messy actuality. The driver's presence was not only a betrayal but also a mirror showing the gaps we had not bothered to see. If you are reading this because you suspect something similar, or because you are trying to decide whether to stay, I will not offer you a line of easy guidance. I will say only what I might have needed to hear. Notice the small things. Ask the awkward questions early. Do not allow convenience to substitute for care. And know that if you decide to try to rebuild, it will be quieter and less glamorous than you imagine. It will demand patience, honesty, and sometimes the courage to leave. I write this not to absolve anyone or to pass judgment, but because telling the story was the only way I could make sense of the rupture. The rides that seemed so ordinary were not harmless. They were small betrayals that, like the slow drip of water widening a crack, brought an entire structure to the verge of collapse. My life after the discovery is neither perfectly mended nor unrecognizable. It is a life that requires more intention. It is a life in which I try to call what matters what it is, and to refuse to let politeness or fear create the scaffolding of a relationship. If anything good came from what I broke, it was that the break taught me to look up from habit and choose. I don't offer this as a blueprint. I offer it as an account. What happened, how I felt, and what I learned. If my story helps even one person notice the tiny things before they become a chasm, then the act of telling was worth it. Mark.